7 p.m. So thank you for being here. My name is AC. My pronouns are they, them. I'm based in Oklahoma City. I am your moderator for all intents and purposes this evening. As I said before, you're invited to share your pronouns and your display name, as well as introduce yourself, name, pronouns, and location in the chat. In addition, I'm going to go ahead and pitch it right now. If you have any questions that are top of mind as this conversation begins, or as we move through the conversation, feel free to drop them in the chat. My primary role in today's conversation is going to be looking for those questions and lifting them up for our panelists so they can focus on giving you their answers. We are welcome to our first kind of inaugural space for Against Carceral Feminism Oklahoma. We're just a collective of folks who believe in taking action against carceral feminism towards the abolition of the prison industrial complex, and we'll define all of those words as we go through so that we're all on the same page. And I really am not going to share much more because I feel like it would be spoilers for everything that's to come in this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here. But one more pitch, if you have questions right now or at any time throughout the meeting, please do feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that space. Oh, and one other thing. Our only request for you as a participant of this meeting is that you keep yourself on mute. If you would like to ask a question verbally or over audio, instead of in the chat, feel free to let me know. You can send me a DM here on Zoom, and I'm happy to figure out a way for you to unmute yourself to ask your question if it's just not coming out right in the texting. All right, so let's get started. Nicole, why don't you introduce yourself? I'd love it if you'd introduce yourself and help us define what is carceral feminism and how did it come about? Where did it come from?
Yeah, Nicole McAfee, she, her, hers. In my day job, I work with the ACLU of Oklahoma doing policy advocacy work around rights and liberties. And we'll start with the note that I think is going to be very much the case for many folks here, that none of us are academic experts in this field. So talking very much sort of from my own learned perspective, which is very much informed by the work of largely folks of color, especially Black women who have done this work for a very long time. And so we'll start sort of with my understanding of carceral feminism, which is that it's very much sort of an idea that increased policing and prosecution and incarceration are the primary solutions to violence against women. I think the important context here is that sort of the anti-violence movement led by women and femmes really came about at the same time as the tough on crime movement, and very much sort of got co-opted into that. And so what we saw as a result was the solution to violence, sort of gender-based violence that folks were facing, being pitched as policing and incarceration, and sort of then getting to the point where those were the only solutions offered and available. So this space is a collective of work kind of beginning to unlearn that.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Kelli, let's go ahead and jump in. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how did you come to this space, and how did you come to the ideas of specifically abolition and carceral feminism?
Hi, I'm Kelli, Pyron, Alvarez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. My daytime job is I'm an assistant teaching professor at OU for first year composition. And then I'm also a first year doctoral student in education studies. So part of the reason, one of the many reasons that brought me kind of to this point is my own experience with incarceration. My dad has been incarcerated for the majority of my life. He started, in boys' homes and juvenile detention centers when he was a teenager. He has been in and out of prison for as long as I can remember. And obviously, it's not working because he keeps going back, right? So there's no rehabilitation, there's no reform there. And it's frustrating to see. And it's frustrating to kind of see the toll that it takes on the mind, on the body. And it's not like there's any progress taking place here, right? And one of the biggest issues that keeps leading him there, well, two of the issues are mental health and drug addiction. And it's if those things were addressed, if he had access to anything that addressed those issues, he wouldn't make the choices that he made. He's not a bad person. He just makes horrible decisions. And obviously, incarceration is not the way to go about addressing that, because it's not preventing crime. It's not preventing him from making horrible decisions. It's just, hey, here, go sit around and wait and starve and maybe not, who knows, right? So just the discrepancies in that is kind of has made me really question how that works. And then of course I worked for a police department way back when as a dispatcher. And that was seeing how officers behave and treat one another and the way that they treat other people. It was just appalling and disgusting. It's this isn't right. It has to change. This is not a good system. And then I just started reading and following people on Twitter, and that's brought me here.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kelli. Aurelius, I would love for you to now introduce yourself. And some of the things in your answer may echo a lot of what Kelli just talked about, but why is carceral feminism specifically a harmful concept, both, maybe within the context of abolition and more broadly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, AC. Hello, everybody. My name is Aurelius Francisco. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the co-executive director of Foundation for Liberating Minds, which is one of the hosts of tonight's conversation. And the job that pays the bills, I'm a policy fellow with the Terrence Crutcher Foundation. So I'm currently living up in Tulsa, but from Oklahoma City, east side of Oklahoma City originally. And so carceral feminism is harmful for a number of reasons. And I think one of the reasons is that it legitimizes the system. It legitimizes the carceral system in this country. And we see this in a number of ways. But one of the major ways that it legitimizes the system is acting as though the system protects the vulnerable. And for the case of carceral feminism, that the carceral system protects people who experience or are particularly vulnerable to be victimized by gender-based violence, any form of gender-based violence. And so this system gets legitimized by saying, we can't abolish the system if we're talking about abolition, but also that we can't even reform the system. We can't make the smallest of reforms because if we do, then survivors won't be protected. And so in many ways, survivors are used as a scapegoat. And we've seen this most recently in Oklahoma with State Question 805, which we'll talk about a little later. But survivors are used as a scapegoat to uphold and continue to funnel millions and millions of dollars into policing institutions, into prisons, and into jails, all under the guise of public safety, and particularly the safety of survivors. And then lastly, carceral feminism is harmful because it doesn't actually protect survivors, right? So we funnel all this money into policing, into prisons, and into courts, and in prosecution, and things of that nature, under this thinking, right, that will protect survivors, or that more rapists or stalkers or abusers will end up behind bars. But in reality, very few actually end up behind bars, spend any amount of time, even in jail or prisons. And what we know when we begin to look into these numbers is that isn't by accident, right? Just as this prison system and the overall prison industrial complex was built on a system of white supremacy, so too was it built on a system of patriarchy. And so we know that institutions built on systems of patriarchy can't protect survivors who are obviously, as we know, mostly women and gender nonconforming folks. And so what we've seen is, as we continue to criminalize, domestic violence or sexual assault, is what has actually happened is, in many cases, that survivors themselves have been criminalized and ended up behind bars for defending themselves and for other things. And so not only has carceral feminism not protected survivors, has the carceral system not protected survivors, but in many cases, and here in Oklahoma, being one of the top incarcerators of women and gender nonconforming folks, we know it incarcerates survivors. And so, it's a lie, it's one big lie, and it continues to just uphold this system.
Yeah. For a little additional context there, the Department of Corrections, I believe in Nicole, 2017, estimated that 2 in 3 people incarcerated in women's prisons in Oklahoma are themselves survivors of domestic or sexual violence. I see that I accidentally muted myself. I apologize. And so 2 in 3 folks who are incarcerated in women's facilities in Oklahoma have experienced some sort of gender-based violence. And so that is a large number that also shows that, right, our carceral system is incarcerating the people that is in theory protecting, to Aurelius's point. So Aurelius, I'll throw it back to you. Can you talk a little bit more about State Question 805 and sort of how this project, this space even came to fruition? I think it's important context for everyone listening.
Sure. So with State Question 805, here in the state of Oklahoma, I know folks are coming from different places. We had a ballot initiative related to sentencing reform that was really a common sense ballot initiative. It was related to, a certain number of offenses that was only pertaining to sentence enhancement. So saying that for these offenses that judges could no longer stack sentences. So somebody couldn't get 40 years, for stealing a lawnmower. It was a 3rd time stealing or something of that nature, right? And so this really sort of common sense, minute reform turned into this huge debate about if you vote yes on State Question 805, if State Question 805, passes, then abusers, domestic violence abusers, will get off scot-free. They'll have no punishment. They won't be sentenced to any time behind bars, right? And so for everyday folk, for common folk who don't engage in this work, who really aren't familiar with the ways that the system actually interacts with survivors and abusers of domestic violence, right? You hear that and you're like, well, of course I'm not going to vote for this, right? I don't want abusers to get off scot-free. And this was done both by people who were involved in the system, sheriffs and DAs and things of that nature. But you also saw many domestic violence organizations pulling their support from State Question 805 under this same idea, right? That abusers would get off scot-free. And the State Question ended up losing. And what it told us was that carceral feminism was incredibly prevalent here in Oklahoma. And that this idea, right, all based in fear, all based in this idea of that abusers will be running amok in our streets, right, and in our communities. That this idea that they would be, that abusers wouldn't be held accountable or punished by the system would happen if we passed the State Question. And so the State Question didn't pass. And so, we know that many of these things, as I talked about in my first answer, simply weren't true. And so this group really came about to address those concerns, but also for a long time, being involved in gender-based violence prevention work wanting to have an alternative to the system to truly provide safety and protection for survivors of gender-based violence, wanting to prevent these things from happening, but also understanding that harm and violence happens in our community. And so what were some other ways for survivors, right? What were resources and alternatives that they could possibly have to address these things? In the state of Oklahoma, we didn't have much of that. And so, that's really, why I wanted to start this group and why, I brought all of you, and why we're here today is to think about really critically, like what safety, what accountability, and what protection for survivors can really look like.
Yeah. Nicole, I would love it if you would expand a little bit about that. I mean, for full transparency, right? I was the deputy campaign manager for State Question 805. Nicole, works with the ACLU of Oklahoma, who was a large part of State Question 805. Can you tell us just a little bit more about how this carceral feminist context is particularly relevant here in Oklahoma, and how it kind of shows up and what it sounds like in our communities?
Yeah, I think I'll start a little bit with State Question 805 as sort of another example here, just because it's something that may be on the minds of people from the past electoral cycle. But at the root of that state question was the idea that sentence enhancements, these repeat sentence penalties, are a bad policy. Longer sentences lead to worse outcomes. They're not disrupting harm. They cost us a lot in terms of both people and taxpayer dollars. And where we sort of often see that the crux of carceral feminism come in to disrupt reform efforts is the idea that certain people should be subjected to those failed policies, so that there is a certain type of conviction that means that even though this policy has bad outcomes, that certain people deserve that. And so I think part of the conversation in disrupting carceral feminism is disrupting that notion that people sort of deserve retribution and punishment and harm. And I think sort of the other really big part of this conversation is the way that we've seen policy conversations for the last several years, even as the state says that it has been doing criminal justice reform, play out, right? And I think even this legislative session, we're almost at the end of it, and we've seen not really any legislation that we can call reform pass. And after an election cycle where everyone used survivors as a scapegoat to not pass a reform measure, when survivors said that they didn't want to see House Bill 2774 passed, because if local governments are forced to comply with ICE detainer requests, that means folks who don't have paperwork, who live in mixed status households, may not be able to safely report. They passed that bill anyway, right? They didn't listen to survivors when it mattered most. We've seen people for years in Oklahoma really come together around failure to protect laws in the way that survivors of gender-based violence who are parents, oftentimes mothers, are sentenced, most often for decades, like we're talking typically about 30 years in prison, and have their kids removed for them. We've asked for reforms around those laws. Instead, this year we saw House Bill 2515 passed, which expands who can be charged with failure to protect. And so I think sort of the other key problem is not only are we seeing survivors, and most often, right, survivors who fit a very certain narrative, white women who have compelling victim stories, used and weaponized to further the prison industrial complex, and to, at the same time, further incarcerate survivors of gender-based violence, especially when those survivors are Black and Indigenous women.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. There's a question in the chat that I want to get to, but I also want to start by saying that one of the reasons that we came together in this collective, and one of the things that is important to us, is that some of us are survivors ourselves, right? I myself am a survivor of sexual violence. And when I came to the idea of abolition, my experience with sexual violence was a part of the thing that made abolition click for me. When I was 21 and I was assaulted, I did not report to the police because I had volunteered with the local shelter, domestic violence shelter in my community for long enough to know that the circumstances under which my assault happened meant that I would not be trusted to tell my own story, that my experience would not be believed, particularly as a queer person. And so when I was introduced to the idea of abolition many years later by a collective of survivors, right, Survived and Punished New York, I thought to myself, oh, that is something that I was already practicing. That was an idea that already lived in my mind. So the question in the chat is, what opportunities exist to engage people who are invested in the carceral system as a response to gendered violence? And I think each of you can speak to this in your different contexts. So I'd love to start with Kelli, since Nicole and Aurelius just both spoke.
So, and I don't know that I can actually answer this question very well, right? I'm new to this conversation. I've been like on the abolition mindset for a while, but I don't have the vocabulary. I've just started doing readings. I've just really started like processing a lot of these thoughts and ideas and learning the vocabulary. And it helps to have friends and to know people that are having these conversations. And for me, it all starts in education, right? In the classes that I'm taking, or even in like the papers that my students write for class. Is like, oh, this is an idea. I want to look into this more, right? And that's even how I found Foundation for Liberating Minds. A student was writing about the organization. I'm like, oh, that sounds awesome. And now I'm here, right? So I look for people, individuals that I can like listen to and learn from. And that's also how I found this book. We Do This Till We Free Us. I mean, I've only read the first 2 articles in here, but it's been really helpful in kind of framing ideas and like, okay, yeah, like I get it. I'm already there. It just helps me articulate those things. And then I can see where other people are having those conversations. And then I just kind of I throw myself in it. I'm like, hey, I don't know you, I'm joining your conversation, let's go. So that's just that's how I do things. So I don't know how much that helps you in any way, but that's just my approach. So finding people that are having those conversations. I mean, y'all found us, and this is the start, right? So.
So sorry, I was dropping in the chat. I've linked in the chat a resource guide that I just absolutely adore, that is about prisons, policing, and punishment generally, but does have a number of references related to carceral feminism. It is huge, it is comprehensive, it has short pieces, it has long pieces, it has all sorts of different, like listening, viewing, whatever the medium that is best for you and supports you the most in undertaking, the expansion of your thinking around these conversations. There is something linked in there for you. So I really recommend it. So Aurelius, how do you start these conversations?
Yeah.
Or what advice do you have?
Yeah, I have these conversations in all types of different environments. Sometimes very spontaneously. Someone who I haven't heard from in years will see all of my postings on Twitter or Instagram to defund the police or, abolish policing or prisons and things of that nature, and swipe up and pretty angrily, like, what do you mean, right? And sometimes I'll engage and sometimes I won't, right? Like, I like to protect my energy. But I think particularly having these conversations with people who are engaged in this work in some way, whether it's gender-based violence prevention or support for survivors, or people who are engaged in criminal justice reform work in the state, the first thing is like building a relationship with that person. And so what I rarely do in conversations with people who are engaged in criminal justice reform work is lead with, you know, we got to burn this whole system down, right? Like abolition now, abolition or nothing. And so I try to have a conversation and, you know, really build that rapport and relationship with them to see where they're coming from. And then I just talk to them about the work that I do, you know, my journey to abolition, and, you know, why I'm an abolitionist and why I believe in this project, and let them come to their own conclusions. And then with Foundation for Liberating Minds, I also like lead workshops and trainings on carceral feminism and on abolition. And so, you know, I would say, you know, to the question of like what opportunities exist right now, you know, shameless plug, FLM does offer trainings and workshops. So if this entity was interested in that, that we break it down really easy for folks and allow folks to come to their own conclusions, right? The objective is not by the end of each conversation or hour-long workshop, every participant is an abolitionist, but allow them to come to their own conclusions and their own answers. And then also, I just think, you know, as we continue to have these conversations, more and more conversations will be happening, but also more and more resources and alternatives will be popping up in the city, across the state, really. And so right now there's a Restorative Justice Institute of Oklahoma, right? And so I think conversations around restorative and transformative justice are really good ones, right? Because I think people will get all the way there, but then we'll stop with, there still needs to be some sort of consequence. And a lot of that is still rooted in punishment, right? And so we have to sort of disengage from the, or understand the difference between punishment and accountability. And so thinking about what accountability can look like without trying to throw somebody behind bars and discard them. And so I think those conversations around restorative and transformative justice are fruitful ones, but also that there's never one good, clean answer, and that those conversations are hard and they're nuanced and they're muddied, and you rarely leave those conversations feeling completely good, but I think they're always worthwhile.
Yeah. I would tend to agree, which is maybe why I'm here. Nicole, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I think that the like starting with folks where they're at is most important. And as much as possible where you can bring the people who are closest to the problems into the equation, that's where you're gonna sort of move hearts and minds the most, right? That we know that it is not the data or the numbers, or even the fiscal impact that folks like to throw around that ultimately make folks get it, right? Like that's not what clicks. It's the hearing from survivors and from folks who have direct experience who say, this isn't working or this isn't what I want, or who are already sort of implementing those other solutions. And so for me, it's oftentimes talking sort of about my first experience with the carceral system, which involved my youngest sister, 8 years younger than me, testifying after the sexual assault of her best friend, and what it meant for a small community to know that someone's kid was now an hour and a half away in a juvenile detention facility, that he would come back to this town without anyone ever addressing sort of trauma for the harm that he caused or asking him what caused it. My sister and her friend had to testify without ever having any follow-up resources or considerations for what that meant for their mental health. And I think that a big part of this is disrupting the narrative that the current system is working, because so much of this relies on the idea that we have to hold up something that's holding back this harm, but we know that it's not disrupting cycles of harm. And I think relative to that sort of, the question in the chat being about like Palomar specifically, and maybe a starting point is pushing them to open up their services to survivors who have violent convictions. A lot of these orgs gatekeep people who themselves, when they are seeking support from law enforcement, find themselves with a conviction. And those are disproportionately Black and Indigenous and trans folks who find themselves with violent convictions. And so not only do they then not have access to those resources, but then those people who are upholding these systems are also sort of further away from the people who say, no, these things aren't perfect or they aren't stopping harm. And so I think that that is a good potential entry point, maybe for orgs that are committed to doing the work around survivors, but who are currently sort of not working with survivors with violent convictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I told myself I wouldn't chime in too much this evening, but I did want to add one specific piece of context that I always think is helpful in these conversations is really beginning to dissect that question of harm disruption. And when we talk about disrupting harm, if the goal of organizations who are serving survivors is to disrupt the harm in their life, for some survivors, the answer is removing that abuser from their life. But we also have to think about it in the cycle that those organizations acknowledge exists, right? Acknowledge that there is a cycle of violence that needs to be broken, and that there is not one person caught in that cycle. It is not just the person who is experiencing abuse or their children who are stuck in the cycle. Everyone is stuck in the cycle of abuse who is involved in the situation. And so when we think about and start to really dissect, that's a place where I often start is, when we say disrupt harm, what do we mean and for who? And that speaks, I think, to Nicole's point of who is worthy of punishment, who is deserving of punishment, and who is worthy of redemption, and who is worthy of second chances. And so many of our social stigmas are connected around drug use or criminal background. All of these kinds of things get so caught up that we often forget that we are talking about real people, our neighbors, our family members. And when we can bring ourselves to that conversation with that knowledge and that remembrance, as we dissect that question, who gets to be safe, right? Who gets to be free? That is I have found is a really important place to start. So there was another question in the chat, and I think that I understand it, so I'm going to read it. And if we aren't quite getting it, please give us a little bit of a nudge in the right direction for your question. So, how would you recommend approaching conversations when people come at this from a public safety perspective specifically? And I think that the idea is here, the dichotomy that people often create between preventing reoffending versus incarceration as punishment. I'm going to leave that one open and let anyone jump in.
So I'll jump in here really quick, and just with what Nicole just put in the chat, right? This idea around public safety. I think what abolition does a great job of is asking questions and asking the question why, right? And it's useful because so many of these things, as it relates to the carceral system, have been the status quo for so long that we don't question them. But they haven't been the status quo for all of eternity, right? These things were built, these things, grew, and they came to be what they are today. And so to the same extent, we can dismantle them and build something new. But to ask the question why or for whom? And so the question around public safety and what about public safety is, when we're talking about public safety for whom? Who actually feels safe under this system? And I think particularly when we're talking about public safety, we're talking about safety for white people. We're talking about public safety for whiteness, right? And this idea that this system, because that's the reality, right? Particularly for the institution of policing. What it is policing is not crime, it's not to prevent crime, but it is actually policing the class line and the race line, right? It is upholding certain structures of society, structures that place Black people, that place trans people, that place queer people, that place poor people, that place disabled people in instances of subservience and instances of inferiority, right? And so what this system actually does, and actually
You muted yourself.
my bad, I don't know, that just happened. I got animated, so I probably accidentally pressed it, right? But it doesn't actually provide safety for individuals, not actually for people. And I think if white people, because this is a question about whiteness, the question of abolition is one of white supremacist capitalism. White people really have to ask themselves if they feel safer as a result of this system, right? Or do they just feel safer with the status quo? And I think when they really interrogate that question for themselves, the answer is no, right? We're funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into police force. We're funneling millions and millions of dollars into prisons and into jails. And nobody feels safer, right? And our only response to that is that, well, we need to criminalize some more. We need to punish some more. We need more police on the ground. And at some point, right, and this is what abolitionists have been trying to do since the 1970s, we have to say that something else needs to happen, that this system doesn't actually work for what we've been duped to believe it says, which is disrupt cycles of harm, provide safety, and provide accountability for people who do harm or commit acts of violence. And so the public safety question is one of public safety for whom? Because you're surely not talking about Black people. You're surely not talking about queer and trans folks, because safety for us isn't this system. And as a matter of fact, right, in most cases, this system means violence for us and for our family members and for our siblings.
So for me, like having that conversation with some of my family members, which I actually started that conversation just a few days ago, it takes time and patience. It's like, okay, but why do you think it works this way? Why do you think this takes place? And it's just kind of getting those answers and bringing them to the realization that, oh, this doesn't work. Because I can't talk about white supremacy or whiteness with some of my family members. They don't understand those concepts, and it would take hours to explain what it is just to even get back on the topic of abolition. And then, so we're talking days here of conversations, and they would lose interest and it wouldn't happen, right? So it's this slow building, in these instances, at least for me, slowly building up that conversation. I'm like, well, why do you think this? Let's look at how this works, right? And it helps that, I have my daddies as an example. Obviously it doesn't work, right? So it's just a lot of patience and time that goes into that in my experience.
I was just going to make the quick note too that I think it's important, right, that question was framed as disrupting violence and keeping someone from causing harm again, that our system as it exists now does not disrupt violence, it delays it. And in the process also subjects that person to more individual violence. And that an important part of the conversation, especially around public safety, has to also anticipate the fact that so many people have been told this is the only way they get safe, right? For so many of our communities who have been subjected to gender-based violence, they have been told that it is a conviction that is the thing that means someone believes you, that means someone is going to take your safety seriously. And that we have to just meet people where they're at with that too, that it is decades of socialization around this, and disrupting someone's entire sort of view of our broader collective safety means that it's not a single conversation, like Kelly said, but one that happens hopefully repeatedly and over time.
Now, also think just real quick, if we could come to whoever you're talking to or talking with, or in conversation with, or in community with, hopefully, right? Come to a shared understanding of what safety looks like for you, and then ask yourself whether or not this system is providing it. And then again, ask that question, why? And then ask the question, what would actually bring about, right, that vision or that idea of true safety. And you don't have to have all the answers. None of us have all of the answers. And that's the thing about abolition, is that, right, we're envisioning this future and we're building it in the present, right? And so it is a million experiments. There's 1millionexperiments.com. It's literally just do something. Miriam Kaba tells us to just try something, right? And see if it works. And that's just what we have to do. But a lot of it, what we do know is that it boils down to resources and the lack of resources that particularly historically looted and marginalized communities do not have.
We have a long question in the chat and a couple other questions. No, that's okay. We are glad for the questions. I do want to add a little thing here. One of the things that's always important for me in these conversations is a reading and a thing that I return to over and over again. The works of Adrienne Maree Brown in Emergent Strategy. Adrienne Maree Brown, someone actually linked a project that they're involved with as well at Barnard about transforming accountability and what do we mean when we say accountability. But one of the things that Adrienne taught me is that the work begins at home, right? That like the first opportunity you have to disrupt these ideas is within yourself, within your household. Is the first time you get the opportunity to stop and say, oh, why did I have that thought? And that the first opportunity that you have to push these boundaries is with the people who are in your closest community and that closest conversation. So let's see, the question in the chat here is, I'm going to read the comment and then I think maybe if we can get reactions. I have mixed feelings about law enforcement and gender-based violence in relation to tribal communities and giving tribes jurisdiction over non-natives who commit acts of violence against Native people. From a sovereignty's perspective, restoring power to tribes should be a victory, especially when there are many Native victims who feel trapped without any legal redress. Plus, a lot of tribes are trying to pioneer non-carceral solutions, which I love and encourage, and it is great if they get expanded jurisdiction, since they can expand this power to serve all survivors, no matter the citizenship of their perpetrator. But for now, that system is not abolitionist. So this person feels caught between disrupting carceral feminism and restoring the inherent rights of tribal governments in terms of, with the goal of serving Native people against attacks of non-Native people. I think I might pitch this question to Nicole with the acknowledgement that if anyone is in this space and is speaking from a tribal perspective, I know that I'm not a tribal member or tribal citizen, I apologize. And if anyone else in this space is and would like to jump in before Nicole, only pitching because of Nicole's knowledge around McGirt and some of these deeper policy-based questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to name that I think that one of the things people in power in the status quo do really well is pitting this as our only option and trying to divide us among communities, right? Saying that the only way Indigenous communities get justice is through VAWA, right? Or sort of through like this mechanism. The only way people experiencing intimate partner violence get justice is through seeing someone incarcerated. It's the only way that programs that serve survivors get funding. And they split us up by community, that like, this is justice for you and nothing else works. And I think that we're seeing this especially sort of in a post-McGirt Oklahoma, where prosecutors are all working very effectively together to put out press statements saying, unless tribes repeat what the Oklahoma system does for people that the Oklahoma system wrongfully claimed jurisdiction over, then injustice is occurring. They don't want sovereignty to happen on tribes' own terms, right? They don't want tribes to get to say what justice is for themselves. And they definitely don't want to have to acknowledge that anything about the status quo is wrong or harmful. And so I think that, yes, as like Kelly noted, this is a much deeper question about sovereignty, and one that I hope sort of as the space reconvenes, that there's really room to look at both kind of decolonizing ideas around feminism and around justice, but that also it's got to be a conversation around not letting people with power tell us what justice looks like, because we know in our communities that none of what we're doing is just.
Okay. The other question in the chat is one that I had anticipated. It is a question that always comes up. It is our closing question for the evening. So this is both this question and any final thoughts, and I'm going to reframe it a little bit in my own words. One, what's the alternative to the carceral system, especially with relation to sexual violence? And then two, if you will share with us, what is your vision for a world without policing or a world without prisons? What does it look like to you?
Let me first not even answer, but offer some potential resources. If not the carceral system, then what to respond to or as a solution to gendered violence. And so I think restorative and transformative justice is one piece of the answer. Community accountability, right? So really thinking about having strong networks of neighborhoods who know each other, who know the neighbors, and who step up to protect one another. And when harm and violence occurs, really going through a process with both the person who has been afflicted and the person who has done the harm and the community, and going through some type of restorative or transformative process, right? But the thing about, and this is where it gets really muddied, right, is the thing about restorative and transformative justice is that consent amongst all parties is what is premised on, right? And so if you have a person who, an abuser or a rapist who is not remorseful in the slightest and who is interested in blaming the survivor, saying that they didn't do this, that they didn't do this, that this person was too drunk, that the person was wearing denim, what have you, right? What do you do, right? Restorative justice really isn't an option. And I don't really have a great answer for it, other than the answer has to be prevention. What are the ways that we can actually prevent these things from root causes? And then actually a much longer answer that we need comprehensive sex ed in this country and in this state, right? That from a very young age, people need to know what body autonomy is, need to know what consent is and looks like, need to understand what these things are, and particularly cisgender men. And I want to bring that into the space as well as a man doing this type of work, right? That we got to get our brothers, right? And we have to get our fellow men to really think about the ways that patriarchy shows up in our life and begin to excavate that from our lives. And so I also think that's a piece of this puzzle. And so that's what I would offer up for that. And then I'll give my vision after Nicole and Kelli wanna.
Yeah, let's do a round of responding to the question, and then we can do vision. Nicole, what's the alternative? What comes next?
Yeah, I think a few things in addition to what Aurelius named is that it's important to acknowledge that so much of the harm is rooted in shame, right? Then when people have been exposed to violence or when they act out with violence, that there is not often space for them to ask for help or space to talk about that is not accompanied by shame. And we know that shame only perpetuates sort of further harm. And that when we look at other conditions that exacerbate harm, oftentimes so much of that is rooted in lack of resources, right? It's things like underemployment, but so often we're talking about lack of real community support, right? Lack of money just to live, right? Like when you are worrying about how you are going to feed yourself, how you are going to stay housed, that then you're often acting from a place of trauma, but also lack of access to healthcare and healthcare resources, especially mental health care, is a part of the conversation. And I think too that knowing we both don't have to have all of the answers and we don't have to find all of the solutions ourselves, that so many people have been doing this work for so long, that a lot of people do this in community already, especially in communities where it is not safe to involve or engage police, and that really being in community with people and learning from folks who have been living and doing this work is a critical part of the solution.
Yeah. Kelli, what comes next? What is the alternative to the carceral system?
I don't know, right? I think there's not just one answer, and knowing that there's not just one answer makes this a little bit overwhelming. And I think in that we have to be creative in the way that we think about what things could be like. And we're going to have to sit in some discomfort in that too, because we're going to have to challenge what we know and how we experience things. And we have to, we're going to have to explore white supremacy. We're going to have to explore rape culture and how these things came to be and why they exist and the different ways that they impact us. And then we have to learn and unlearn so much, and it's uncomfortable and it takes a lot of time, but then we have to be really creative, and we do need all of these things that y'all are talking about in the chat, like comprehensive sex ed. Yes, we need to talk about all of these things, right? There's so many different things that we need to do and that can be included in this and should be, that it does get overwhelming. And I think we just have to jump in. We're not going to have an answer right away, and there are multiple answers, and we're just going to have to jump in, go with one, and then start working through it and figuring it out. And I like structure and organization, and the idea of that makes me really anxious, and I don't like it, but there's no other way. I mean, unless somebody else can see one and wants to explain that to me, I'm open, but I don't know that there's another way to do that besides just, we got to go, we got to do it, we got to do something. And I also think another thing that makes these conversations really difficult, a lot of the ideas that we have to work through, a lot of these concepts that we have to learn about and then work to unlearn because they're so ingrained, we can't have these conversations in a formal capacity in so many places because of the new laws that have passed. We can't talk about critical race theory. We can't talk about divisive issues like race or racism. And if we're trying to educate a large group of people, right? This isn't going to work. That's not, and that's why those laws exist, right? They don't want us to do this. So we have to just be creative.
Yeah. My answer to this question is always, I don't know. I will not be the one to come up with the answer, certainly not by myself. It will be a project of us deciding collectively that what we're doing right now is not working, and working to create and imagine something new and beautiful and wonderful. But it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take all of us. So to that question, I love, this is like my go-to either opening or closing question, to have a bright moment at the end of our conversation, hopefully a bright moment, is what does a world without police and prisons look like for you? One of the ways that it looks for me is a world that a country, a place that is organized by community gardens instead of police precincts or police jurisdictions. as their primary organizing principle and how you get around. If you who are listening, as our panelists share, have something that is your vision for a world without prisons and police, I would love it also if you would share in the chat as we join in this closing question. And I think, well, let's go reverse order: Kelli, Nicole, and then Aurelius.
Can you ask that question again?
Yeah, what is your vision for a world? When you imagine a world without prisons and police, what does it look like to you?
Two words come to mind: open and transparent, right? We're having open conversations. We're being transparent with our thoughts, our ideas, and the issues that we're facing. And I think, in talking with my dad, who's still currently incarcerated, right? He has 3 more years to go. He's like, I'm sorry for the way that I raised you. I didn't know any better. We didn't talk about these things growing up. Mm-hmm. And I think we need a space to be able to talk through our feelings and our thoughts and our experiences without shame, without judgment. And then have someone help us assess that. And then if we need more care, if we need more mental health support, then we have it. And I would love to see more mental health funding initiatives, things like that. It's just so important. And I think it's a big component to a lot of the issues for people that harm others and people that are harmed. Like we all need therapy, right? We all need to talk to someone for different reasons. We all have some sort of trauma that we're working through. Big trauma, little trauma, it doesn't matter, right? And I think that dealing with our traumas is that I would love to see that.
I'm going to make a selfish plug first that I am dropping a link for a form again, and we would love to get your feedback and also be able to loop you in to future conversations like this, because we hope very much that this is just the first of many. I think for me, a world without policing and prisons looks like everyone knowing that they are so much more than the worst day of their life. It's never having to turn on the news and learn about the murder of one of our community members. And it's really based in feeling cared for and caring for others. Knowing that there are people in your community that are there for you and will support you when you need it, and that you get to offer that same sort of collective support to help take care of everyone else every day.
Yeah, I never have a short answer for this question, and so let me just say, Laura, to your question, I think that's the entire point of why we created this collective around carceral feminism, right? Is for this to serve as an intervention and for different organizations who are doing work that revolves around this area. So, obviously gender-based violence prevention orgs, sex ed orgs, people who are doing criminal justice reform work in the state to get involved and to learn about these things so that we are better informed when we are, thinking about policy efforts and things of that nature. And so, if you're with an organization or just as an individual, I'd encourage you to fill out that form and, get involved, because like Kelli said, right, it can get overwhelming, but again, what Mariam Kaba tells us is to do something in our sphere of influence. And we all have a sphere of influence, regardless of how big or small, but we can all make an impact. And I think just real quick, my vision for a world without police and prisons is a world where all people can live a dignified life, where the basic necessities are met, where everyone has access to nourishing food and to shelter and to healthcare, right? And in this country, in the United States, in the richest country in the world, we know that many of those things are simply not the case for too many of our neighbors. And then lastly, that answer I can't answer alone, that answer has to come in community, and it has to be an answer that we are all engaged in. Because like Gil Scott Heron says, the revolution will not be televised, it will be live. We're all gonna be involved in it, and we gotta pick a side. And I think all of you are on the right side by engaging in this work and engaging in this conversation, which is the freedom side. And it's about engaging a critical mass of people to get to that place, and whatever that world looks like, hopefully in our lifetime. So I thank you all.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you for joining us this evening. This is the first conversation of many. It is an ongoing conversation. It is part of a larger fabric of conversations happening in communities across the country and across the world about abolition, about carceral feminism, about how we get a little more free every day, and how we hold and care for one of each other a little bit better every day. I think I want to leave you all with the words of Mariame Kaba, beyond just do something, something that I guide my life with, consistent, principled, thoughtful, imperfect action over the long haul. That is at the core of everything that we do in this space, and everything that I do as I move through the world. So I encourage you to engage with us, engage with abolition, engage with one another, and let's grow this conversation together. Thanks all for being here. This conversation has been recorded, so if you had a friend who missed out, we'll be uploading it and sharing it for those folks as well. Thanks everyone, have a good evening.
Can we stop recording, whoever's recording?
Oh.